What if your entire town depended on a neighbor who suddenly turned their back on you? By spring 2025, 10 U.S. border towns faced a chilling fate, abandoned, cursed by a vanishing trade. Eager to unravel more gripping true mysteries, hit like and subscribe to explore haunting historical accounts with us. Picture this, a quiet coastal town, its streets lined with quaint shops, the air thick with the scent of salt and pine. It's March 17, 2025, in Point Roberts, Washington, and the international marketplace is eerily silent. Shelves that once overflowed with goods are half empty, and the cash register hasn't rung in hours. Why? Because the Canadians, who made this town hum with life, have vanished. Imagine standing in that grocery store, the fluorescent lights flickering, hearing nothing but the hum of a lonely fridge. What happened to this place? How does an entire community just fade away? I first heard about Point Roberts back in 2021, when a friend mentioned this odd little American town you can only reach by driving through Canada. It stuck with me, this quirky peninsula, a 5-square-mile speck of the U.S. surrounded by water in British Columbia, created by the 1846 Oregon Treaty. Point Roberts was a thriving hub where Canadians owned 70% of the homes and fueled the economy with their daily visits for cheap gas, groceries, and beer. But by early 2025, something shifted. The border, once a friendly line marked by a shin-high concrete barrier, became a wall of resentment. Businesses shuttered, homes sat empty, and a creeping sense of abandonment settled over the town like fog rolling in from Boundary Bay. Let me take you back to the heart of this story. 210 U.S. border towns: Point Roberts, Washington; Blaine, Washington; Sumas, Washington; Linden, Washington; Port Huron, Michigan; Madawaska, Maine; Calais, Maine; Plattsburgh, New York; Derby Line, Vermont; and Champlain, New York, each tethered to Canada by history, geography, and trade. These weren't just towns, they were living proof of a bond between two nations, where people crossed the border daily to work, shop, or visit family. In Point Roberts, gas stations priced fuel in liters to cater to Canadians. In Madawaska, Maine, a paper mill thrived by piping pulp across the St. John River from Edmundston, New Brunswick. In Plattsburgh, New York, Canadian companies like kept factories humming. But in 2025, that bond frayed, and these towns faced a ghostly exodus that left them teetering on the edge of oblivion. The trouble began in January 2025, when U.S. tariffs 25% on Canadian goods like steel, aluminum, and vehicles hit like a sledgehammer. Canada retaliated with tariffs of their own, and a trade war erupted. But it wasn't just economics. Political rhetoric, especially claims that Canada could become the 51st state, sparked outrage north of the border. Canadians, fiercely proud of their sovereignty, began boycotting American towns. In Point Roberts, border crossings dropped 29.3% by April 2025 compared to the previous year. Imagine being a shop owner, watching your customers, your friends disappear overnight. Ali Hayton, who runs the international marketplace, saw her sales plummet 20%. "I totally understand where the Canadians are coming from," she said, "but we need their support when times are tough. Nobody saw this coming." Now, close your eyes and picture Point Roberts Main Street, Ty Drive. It's usually bustling with Canadian cars, but now it's a ghost town. The Saltwater Calf, once packed at lunch, sits empty. Tamra Hansen, its owner, told reporters her sales dropped 55% worse than during the COVID-19 border closures. "This is not normal," she said, staring at empty tables. "To not have anybody sitting in the restaurant. Can you imagine pouring your heart into a business only to watch it wither because of forces beyond your control? I can't help but wonder, how do you keep going when your livelihood depends on a border that's suddenly a battleground?" The decline wasn't just about money, it was personal. In Point Roberts, where half the 1,200 residents hold dual citizenship. The border was never a divide, it was a bridge. Canadians and Americans celebrated Canada Day and the 4th of July together, flying both flags side by side. But by March 2025, tensions boiled over. Some residents reported harassment when crossing into Canada. Brian Calder, a fourth-gen Point Roberts resident, told of locals being confronted in Sowson. "What are you doing here? Get back to your own country." He even started selling bumper stickers, reading Point Roberts supports Canada, to mend the rift. Just think, this man was fighting to save his town's soul, not just its economy. Do we still see that kind of loyalty today? Other border towns felt the same chill. In Blaine, Washington, the Chevron on Peace Portal Drive once sold 90% of its fuel to Canadians. By spring 2025, sales tanked as Canadian visitors dwindled. In Port Huron, Michigan, the Blue Water Bridge, usually a lifeline for cross-border shoppers, saw a 32% drop in Canadian car trips compared to March 2024. Christina Lampert, a waitress at Freighter's restaurant, stopped sorting her tips into Canadian and American piles because the Canadian cash had all but disappeared. In Madawaska, Maine, the Twin Rivers Paper Co. faced uncertainty as tariffs threatened its cross-border pulp supply. These towns, once vibrant, were becoming relics, their streets as quiet as graveyards. But let's zoom out for a moment. Why did this happen? The 1846 Oregon Treaty set the 49th parallel as the U.S.-Canada border, leaving Point Roberts and other quirks of geography stranded. These towns leaned on Canada for survival. 90% of Point Roberts' economy came from British Columbia. When COVID-19 closed the border for 19 months, these communities took a hit, losing up to 80% of their business. They were just recovering when the 2025 trade war struck. Tariffs on Canadian goods jacked up prices, and Canada's retaliatory tariffs made it costly for Americans to source materials from across the border. In Point Roberts, building a house that cost $300,000 now neared $450,000. Add to that the emotional sting of being called the 51st state, and Canadians simply stopped coming. Imagine if you lived in one of these towns, waking up each day to fewer cars, emptier stores, and a growing sense of dread. In Point Roberts, the international marketplace went from 4 weekly delivery trucks to 1 or 2. Point Parcel, a 24-year-old shipping business, closed permanently in April 2025. Its owner Beth Calder citing the tariffs as the final blow. Even the quirky Rubber Duck Museum, a local gem, announced it would relocate to Sowson because foot traffic had dried up. Crystal King, its owner, said, "It became immediately unsustainable." Doesn't that hit you in the gut? A museum dedicated to rubber ducks, of all things, forced to flee because of a trade war nobody asked for. The human toll was stark. Larry Musselwhite, 75, who runs Larry's Liquor Locker in Point Roberts, saw sales drop 40%. "I can't even think about retiring right now," he said, blaming the tariffs. In Plattsburgh, New York, Canadian companies like Novabis absorbed price hikes, but the uncertainty loomed like a storm cloud. In Calais, Maine, residents who shared fire stations and 4th of July celebrations with St. Stephen, New Brunswick, felt the sting of rising hostility. Brian Calder put it best, "We didn't do anything wrong. They didn't do anything wrong. Why are we in this mess?" That question haunts me. When did neighbors become enemies? Yet, there were glimmers of resistance. In Point Roberts, a local named Morrison organized elbows down, sunglasses on events to lure Canadians back to Kaniski's Reef and the Pier restaurant. About 50 people showed up to the first event, a small victory that put coins in local tills. In Madawaska, mill workers like Mike Bolu held their breath, hoping the cross-border pulp supply would survive the tariffs. But the fear lingered. What if Canada cut off essentials like electricity or water? which Point Roberts relied on from Metro Vancouver and BC Hydro. Calder warned, that would wipe us out. Imagine living in a town where your power, your water, your very survival depends on a neighbor who's been pushed too far. The eerie decline of these towns wasn't just economic, it felt cursed, like a shadow had fallen over communities that once thrived on unity. In Derbyline, Vermont, where the border runs through a library, residents stopped crossing into Stansted, Quebec, for fear of tariffs or hostility. In Champlain, New York, the manufacturing sector, bolstered by Canadian firms, faced layoffs as costs soared. The Peace Arch Monument between Blaine and Surrey, BC, inscribed with children of a common mother, stood as a bitter reminder of what was lost. If they got it over 120 years ago, Calder said, what right does this character have to undermine all of that? As spring turned to summer 2025, the future looked grim. Point Roberts' real estate market, driven by Canadian buyers, stalled as owners began calling realtors to gauge property values. In Port Huron, Mayor Anita Ashford pleaded for federal leaders to see the human cost. We are not responsible for this. The U.S. Travel Association estimated a 10% drop in Canadian tourism could cost 14,000 jobs and $2.1 billion nationwide. With border towns hit hardest, Michigan alone stood to lose $238 million from Canadian visitors. These numbers aren't just stats, they're people's lives, dreams, and futures crumbling. I keep thinking about Tamara Hansen at the Saltwater Cafe, refusing to close despite the empty tables, or Brian Calder, fighting for his town with bumper stickers and pleas to Canadian officials. These folks weren't just business owners or residents, they were holding on to a way of life. I can't shake the image of Point Roberts' quiet beaches, once filled with Canadian day trippers, now deserted under a gray sky. It makes me wonder, how do you rebuild when your town's heart is tied to a border that's become a wound? The lesson here isn't just about trade or tariffs. It's about how fragile our connections are, how quickly trust can erode when politics and pride get in the way. These 10 towns, Point Roberts, Blaine, Sumas, Linden, Port Huron, Madawaska, Calais, Plattsburgh, Derbyline, Champlain, weren't just abandoned by customers. They were abandoned by a system that forgot the human cost of its decisions. Maybe their names will fade from maps, their streets left to whisper tales of better days, but their spirit the stubborn, hopeful heartbeat of communities that refused to give up, lives on, a quiet defiance against a cursed fate. Are you captivated by this unsettling story? Let us know your location and time in the comments. We'd love to know where and when you're watching from. Keep chasing the unknown.